Part 1, Chapter 1. Towards the end of November, during a thaw, at 9 o'clock one morning, a train on the Warsaw and Petersburg Railway was approaching the latter city at full speed. The morning was so damp and misty that it was only with great difficulty that the day succeeded in breaking, and it was impossible to distinguish anything more than a few yards away from the carriage windows. Some of the passengers by this particular train were returning from abroad, but the third-class carriages were the best filled, chiefly with insignificant persons of various occupations and degrees, picked up at the different stations near a town. All of them seemed weary, and most of them had sleepy eyes and a shivering expression, while their complexions generally appeared to have taken on the colour of the fog outside. When day dawned, two passengers in one of the third-class carriages found themselves opposite each other. Both were young fellows, both were rather poorly dressed, both had remarkable faces, and both were evidently anxious to start a conversation. If they had but known why, at this particular moment, they were both remarkable persons, they would undoubtedly have wondered at the strange chance which had set them down opposite to one another in a third-class carriage of the Warsaw Railway Company. One of them was a young fellow of about 27, not tall, with black curling hair and small grey fiery eyes. His nose was broad and flat, and he had high cheekbones. His thin lips were constantly compressed into an impudent, ironical, it might almost be called a malicious smile. But his forehead was high and well formed, and atoned for a good deal of the ugliness of the lower part of his face. A special feature of this physiognomy was its death-like pallor, which gave to the whole man an indescribably emaciated appearance, in spite of his hard look, and at the same time a sort of passionate and suffering expression, which did not harmonize with his impudent, sarcastic smile and keen, self-satisfied bearing. He wore a large fur, or rather Astrakhan, overcoat, which had kept him warm all night, while his neighbour had been obliged to bear the full severity of a Russian November night entirely unprepared. His wide sleeveless mantle with a large cape to it, the sort of cloak one sees upon travellers during the winter months in Switzerland or North Italy, was by no means adapted to the long cold journey through Russia, from Eydkuhnen to St. Petersburg. The wearer of this cloak was a young fellow also of about 26 or 27 years of age, slightly above the middle height, very fair, with a thin, pointed and very light-coloured beard. His eyes were large and blue, and had an intent look about them, yet that heavy expression, which some people affirm to be a peculiarity as well as evidence of an epileptic subject. His face was decidedly a pleasant one for all that, refined but quite colourless, except for the circumstance that at this moment it was blue with cold. He held a bundle made up of an old faded silk handkerchief that apparently contained all his travelling wardrobe, and wore thick shoes and gaiters, his whole appearance being very un-Russian. His black-haired neighbour inspected these peculiarities, having nothing better to do, and at length remarked, with that rude enjoyment of the discomforts of others which the common classes so often show, "Cold?" "Very," said his neighbour readily, "and this is a thaw too. Fancy if it had been a hard frost. I never thought it would be so cold in the old country. I've grown quite out of the way of it." "What, been abroad, I suppose?" "Yes, straight from Switzerland." "Phew, my goodness!" The black-haired young fellow whistled and then laughed. The conversation proceeded. The readiness of the fair-haired young man in the cloak to answer all his opposite neighbour's questions was surprising. He seemed to have no suspicion of any impertinence or inappropriateness in the fact of such questions being put to him. Replying to them, he made known to the inquirer that he certainly had been long absent from Russia, more than 4 years, that he had been sent abroad for his health, that he had suffered from some strange nervous malady, a kind of epilepsy with convulsive spasms. His interlocutor burst out laughing several times at his answers, and more than ever, when to the question whether he had been cured, the patient replied, "No, they did not cure me." "Ha, that's it. You stumped up your money for nothing, and we believe in those fellows here," remarked the black-haired individual sarcastically. "Gospel truth, sir, gospel truth," exclaimed another passenger, a shabbily dressed man of about 40, who looked like a clerk, and possessed a red nose and a very blotchy face. "Gospel truth. All they do is get hold of our good Russian money, free, gratis, and for nothing." "Oh, but you're quite wrong in my particular instance," said the Swiss patient quietly. "Of course I can't argue the matter, because I know only my own case, but my doctor gave me money, and he had very little, to pay my journey back, besides having kept me at his own expense while there for nearly 2 years." "Why, was there no one else to pay for you?" asked the black-haired one. "No, Mr. Pavlicheff, who had been supporting me there, died a couple of years ago. I wrote to Mrs. General Yepanchin at the time. She is a distant relative of mine, but she did not answer my letter, and so eventually I came back." "And where have you come to?" "That is, where am I going to stay? I really don't quite know yet. Both the listeners laughed again. "I suppose your whole set-up is in that bundle, then?" asked the first. "I bet anything it is," exclaimed the red-nosed passenger with extreme satisfaction, "and that he has precious little in the luggage van. Though, of course, poverty is no crime. We must remember that." It appeared that it was indeed as they had surmised. The young fellow hastened to admit the fact with wonderful readiness. "Your bundle has some importance, however," continued the clerk when they had laughed their fill. It was observable that the subject of their mirth joined in the laughter when he saw them laughing. "For though I dare say it is not stuffed full of Friedrich d'Or and Louis d'Or, judge from your costume and gaiters, still, if you can add to your possessions such a valuable property as a relation like Mrs. General Yepanchin, then your bundle becomes a significant object at once. That is, of course, if you really are a relative of Mrs. Yepanchin's, and have not made a little error through, well, absence of mind, which is very common to human beings, or say through a too luxuriant fancy." "Oh, you are right again," said the fair-haired traveller, "for I really am almost wrong when I say she and I are related. She is hardly a relation at all. So little, in fact, that I was not in the least surprised to have no answer to my letter. I expected as much." You spent your postage for nothing, then?" You are candid, however, and that is commendable." "Mrs. Yepanchin? Oh yes, a most eminent person. I know her. As for Mr. Pavlicheff, who supported you in Switzerland, I know him too. At least if it was the Nikolai Andreevitch of that name. A fine fellow he was, and had a property of 4,000 souls in his day." "Yes, Nikolai Andreevitch, that was his name." And the young fellow looked earnestly and with curiosity at the all-knowing gentleman with the red nose. This sort of character is met with pretty frequently in a certain class. They are people who know everyone, That is, they know where a man is employed, what his salary is, whom he knows, whom he married, what money his wife had, who are his cousins and second cousins, etc., etc. These men generally have about £100 a year to live on, and they spend their whole time and talents in the amassing of this style of knowledge, which they reduce, or raise, to the standard of a science. During the latter part of the conversation, the black-haired young man had become very impatient. He stared out of the window and fidgeted, and evidently longed for the end of the journey. He was very absent. He would appear to listen and heard nothing, and he would laugh of a sudden, evidently with no idea of what he was laughing about. "Excuse me," said the red-nosed man to the young fellow with the bundle, rather suddenly. "Whom have I the honour to be talking to?" "Prince Lьов Nikolaevich Myshkin," replied the latter with perfect readiness. "Prince Myshkin? Lьov Nikolaevich? I don't know, I'm sure. I may say I have never heard of such a person," said the clerk thoughtfully. "At least the name, I admit, is historical. Karamzin must mention the family name, of course, in his history. But as an individual, one never hears of any Prince Myshkin nowadays." "Of course not," replied the prince. "There are none except myself. I believe I am the last and only one. As to my forefathers, they have always been a poor lot. My own father was a sub-lieutenant in the army. I don't know how Mrs. Yepanchin comes into the Myshkin family, but she is descended from the Princess Myshkin, and she too is the last of her line." "And did you learn science and all that with your professor over there?" asked the black-haired passenger. "Oh yes, I did learn a little, but—" "I've never learned anything whatever," said the other. "Oh, but I learnt very little, you know," added the prince, as though excusing himself. "They could not teach me very much on account of my illness." "Do you know the Rogozhins?" asked his questioner abruptly. "No, I don't, not at all. I hardly know anyone in Russia. Why, is that your name?" "Yes, I am Rogozhin, Parfen Rogozhin." "Parfen Rogozhin? Dear me! Then don't you belong to those very Rogozhins, perhaps?" began the clerk, with a very perceptible increase of civility in his tone. "Yes, those very ones," interrupted Rogozhin impatiently and with scant courtesy. I may remark that he had not once taken any notice of the blotchy-faced passenger, and had hitherto addressed all his remarks direct to the prince. "Dear me, is it possible?" observed the clerk, while his face assumed an expression of great deference and servility, if not of absolute alarm. "What? A son of that very Semyon Rogozhin, hereditary honourable citizen, who died a month or so ago and left 2.5 millions of roubles. And how do you know that he left 2.5 millions of roubles?" asked Rogozhin disdainfully, and not deigning so much as to look at the other. "However, it's true enough that my father died a month ago, and that here am I returning from Pskov a month after, with hardly a boot to my foot. They've treated me like a dog. I've been ill of fever at Pskov the whole time, and not a line nor farthing of money have I received from my mother or my confounded brother. And now you'll have 1 million roubles at least. Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the clerk, rubbing his hands. "5 weeks since I was just like yourself," continued Rogozhin, addressing the prince, "with nothing but a bundle and the clothes I wore. I ran away from my father and came to Pskov, to my aunt's house, where I caved in at once with fever, and he went and died while I was away. All honour to my respected father's memory, but he uncommonly nearly killed me all the same. Give you my word, prince, if I hadn't cut and run then, when I did, he'd have murdered me like a dog." "I suppose you angered him somehow?" asked the prince, looking at the millionaire with considerable curiosity. But though there may have been something remarkable in the fact that this man was heir to millions of roubles, there was something about him which surprised and interested the prince more than that. Rogojin, too, seemed to have taken up the conversation with unusual alacrity. It appeared that he was still in a considerable state of excitement, if not absolutely feverish, and was in real need of someone to talk to, for the mere sake of talking, a safety valve to his agitation. As for his red-nosed neighbour, the latter, since the information as to the identity of Rogojin hung over him, seemed to be living on the honey of his words and in the breath of his nostrils, catching at every syllable as though it were a pearl of great price. "Oh yes, I angered him. I certainly did anger him," replied Rogojin. "But what puts me out so is my brother. Of course my mother couldn't do anything, she's too old, and whatever brother Shonka says is law for her. But why couldn't he let me know? He sent a telegram, they say. What's the good of a telegram? It frightened my aunt so that she sent it back to the office unopened, and there it's been ever since. It's only thanks to Konyev that I heard at all. He wrote me all about it. He says my brother cut off the gold tassels from my father's coffin at night because they're worth a lot of money, says he. Why, I can get him sent off to Siberia for that alone if I like. It's sacrilege. Here, you, scarecrow," he added, addressing the clerk at his side. "Is it sacrilege or not, by law?" "Sacrilege, certainly. Certainly sacrilege," said the latter. "And it's Siberia for sacrilege, isn't it?" "Undoubtedly so. Siberia, of course." "They will think that I'm still ill," continued Rogojin to the prince. "But I sloped off quietly, seedy as I was, took the train and came away. Aha, brother Shonka, you'll have to open your gates and let me in, my boy. I know he told tales about me to my father. I know that well enough. But I certainly did rile my father about Nastasia Philipovna. That's very sure. That was my own doing." "Nastasia Philipovna," said the clerk, as though trying to think out something. "Come, you know nothing about her," said Rogojin impatiently. "And supposing I do know something," observed the other triumphantly. "Bosh! There are plenty of Nastasia Philipovnas. And what an impertinent beast you are," he added angrily. "I thought some creature like you would hang on to me as soon as I got hold of my money." "Oh, but I do know, as it happens," said the clerk in an aggravating manner. "Lebedeff knows all about her. You are pleased to reproach me, your excellency. But what if I prove that I am right after all? Nastasia Philipovna's family name is Barashkov. I know, you see, and she is a very well-known lady indeed, and comes of a good family too. She is connected with one Totsky, Afanasy Ivanovitch, a man of considerable property, a director of companies and so on, and a great friend of General Yepanchin, who is interested in the same matters as he is." "My eyes," said Rogojin, really surprised at last. "The devil take the fellow! How does he know that?" "Why, he knows everything. Lebedeff knows everything. I was a month or two with Lihachof after his father died, your excellency, and while he was knocking about, he's in the debtor's prison now, I was with him, and he couldn't do a thing without Lebedeff. And I got to know Nastasia Philipovna and several people at that time." "Nastasia Philipovna? Why, you don't mean to say that she and Lihachof?" cried Rogojin, turning quite pale. "No, nothing of the sort, I assure you," said Lebedeff hastily. "Oh dear no, not for the world. Totski's the only man with any chance there. Oh no." He takes her to his box at the opera at the French Theatre of an evening, and the officers and people all look at her and say, 'By Jove, there's the famous Nastasia Philipovna.' But no one ever gets any further than that, for there is nothing more to say." "Yes, it's quite true," said Rogojin, frowning gloomily. "So Zaleshoff told me. I was walking about the Nevsky one fine day, prince, in my father's old coat, when she suddenly came out of a shop and stepped into her carriage. I swear I was all of a blaze at once. Then I met Zaleshoff, looking like a hairdresser's assistant, got up as fine as I don't know who, while I looked like a tinker. 'Don't flatter yourself, my boy,' said he. 'She's not for such as you. She's a princess, she is, and her name is Nastasia Philipovna Barashkov, and she lives with Totsky, who wishes to get rid of her because he's growing rather old, 55 or so, and wants to marry a certain beauty, the loveliest woman in all Petersburg.' And then he told me that I could see Nastasia Philipovna at the opera house that evening if I liked, and described which was her box. Well, I'd like to see my father allowing any of us to go to the theatre. He'd sooner have killed us any day. However, I went for an hour or so and saw Nastasia Philipovna, and I never slept a wink all night after. Next morning my father happened to give me 2 government loan bonds to sell, worth nearly 5,000 roubles each. 'Sell them,' said he, 'and then take 7,500 roubles to the office, give them to the cashier, and bring me back the rest of the 10,000, without looking in anywhere on the way. Look sharp, I shall be waiting for you.' Well, I sold the bonds, but I didn't take the 7,000 roubles to the office. I went straight to the English shop and chose a pair of earrings with a diamond the size of a nut in each. They cost 400 roubles more than I had, so I gave my name, and they trusted me. With the earrings I went at once to Zaleshoff's. 'Come on,' I said, 'come on to Nastasia Philipovna's.' And off we went without more ado. I tell you, I hadn't a notion of what was about me or before me or below my feet all the way. I saw nothing whatever. We went straight into her drawing-room, and then she came out to us. I didn't dare say right out who I was, but Zalesh is a LibriVox.
¿Cómo se llama este güey? Audiobooks.
Starts.
Buddha's philosophy. A ver.
A prince walks away from a palace at midnight, leaving behind wealth that could buy nations, a wife who adores him, and a newborn son who will never know his father. He carries nothing but questions that burn like acid in his mind. Within hours he will trade silk robes for rags, a comfortable bed for the forest floor, guaranteed meals for the uncertainty of begging. Most people would call this the story of a man losing his sanity. History calls it the birth of one of humanity's most penetrating investigations into the nature of reality itself. What emerged from this radical experiment in human consciousness would not merely offer comfort to the suffering, but would dissect suffering like a master surgeon, revealing its hidden anatomy and precise mechanisms. This is not just another spiritual teaching promising peace and happiness. This is a complete manual for psychological liberation, tested across 25 centuries by millions of practitioners, refined through countless generations of careful observation. The insights that follow represent perhaps the most systematic analysis of human consciousness ever undertaken. They offer not beliefs to adopt, but experiments to conduct in the laboratory of your own mind. They reveal not what you should think, but how thinking itself operates, how suffering is manufactured, and how the very sense of being a separate self is constructed moment by moment in awareness. Part 1. The surgical precision of awakening. The Buddha's genius lay not in his mystical experiences, but in his ability to analyze those experiences with scientific rigor. Unlike other spiritual teachers who spoke in metaphors and poetry, he dissected consciousness like a skilled anatomist, identifying its component parts and revealing how they function together to create both suffering and liberation. This analytical approach makes Buddhist psychology remarkably practical and verifiable. Every insight can be tested through direct experience. The foundation of this entire system rests on 4 observations so simple they sound almost trivial, yet so profound they can completely restructure how consciousness relates to reality. These are called the 4 Noble Truths, though the word truth is misleading in English. In the original language, the term is closer to noble realities or ennobling insights. They are not beliefs to accept, but realities to investigate and directly perceive. The first noble truth states that life contains dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but encompassing a much broader range of unsatisfactory experience. The Buddha identified this not through pessimism, but through unflinching observation of how consciousness actually operates. He noticed that even pleasant experiences carry within them a subtle undertone of incompleteness, a sense that something is always slightly off, never quite perfect. Consider your experience of eating when hungry. The first few bites bring genuine satisfaction, but notice what happens as the meal continues. The pleasure gradually diminishes until eating becomes mechanical, then uncomfortable if you continue too long. This is not a problem with food or hunger. This is the nature of all conditioned experience. It arises, peaks, and then inevitably declines, leaving consciousness to seek the next source of satisfaction. But the Buddha's analysis goes much deeper than this obvious pattern. He identified 3 distinct levels of dukkha that operate simultaneously in all conscious experience. The first level is dukkha, obvious suffering that everyone recognizes. Physical pain, emotional distress, the agony of losing what you love, the frustration of not getting what you want. This level needs no explanation because it announces itself clearly to consciousness. The second level, viparinama dukkha, is far more subtle and therefore more dangerous. This is the suffering that comes from the impermanent nature of all conditioned phenomena. Every pleasurable experience contains the seeds of its own dissolution. Every moment of happiness is simultaneously a moment moving toward the end of that happiness. This creates a subtle but persistent anxiety that permeates even the most enjoyable experiences. You cannot fully relax into pleasure because some part of you is already anticipating its loss. Think about falling in love, one of life's most ecstatic experiences. Even in the heights of romantic bliss, there is usually an undercurrent of insecurity. Will this last? What if they change their mind? What if I am not worthy of this love? These anxieties arise not because something is wrong, but because consciousness intuitively recognizes the impermanent nature of all conditioned experience. The more precious something becomes, the more vulnerable you feel to its potential loss. The third level, sankhara dukkha, penetrates deepest of all and represents the Buddha's most original psychological insight. This is the suffering that comes from being a conscious entity constantly engaged in the process of becoming. Even when nothing is obviously wrong, even when circumstances are favorable, there remains a fundamental restlessness at the core of ordinary consciousness. This is not neurosis or psychological dysfunction. This is the natural result of consciousness identifying with patterns that are constantly changing. Imagine trying to build a stable sense of identity on quicksand. Every thought you think disappears almost immediately. Every emotion you feel changes into something else. Every sensation in your body is constantly shifting. Your beliefs evolve, your preferences change, your memories fade and distort. Even your physical body replaces nearly all its cells every 7 years. Yet something in consciousness keeps trying to find solid ground in this flux, keeps attempting to establish a permanent reference point in an ocean of change. This constant effort to solidify the fluid creates a persistent underlying tension. The Buddha observed that this third level of suffering is so fundamental to ordinary consciousness that most people do not even recognize it. It operates like background radiation, coloring every experience with a subtle sense of incompleteness. This is why even people with comfortable lives, loving relationships and meaningful work often feel that something essential is missing. This is why achieving long-desired goals often brings less satisfaction than expected. This is why consciousness keeps seeking the next experience, the next achievement, the next solution to the puzzle of existence. But the Buddha's analysis of suffering extends even further into the mechanics of how different types of dukkha interact and reinforce each other. He noticed that consciousness develops elaborate strategies to avoid obvious suffering, but these strategies often increase the more subtle forms. The pursuit of pleasure as an escape from pain creates attachment, which increases vulnerability to the suffering of change. The attempt to build a secure identity creates rigid patterns of thinking and behavior, which increases the suffering of constantly trying to maintain something that is inherently fluid. He also observed that consciousness tends to blame external circumstances for its suffering, leading to endless attempts to rearrange the world rather than understanding the internal mechanisms that create dissatisfaction. People change jobs, relationships, locations, belief systems, thinking that the right external configuration will finally provide lasting contentment. But because the fundamental problem lies in how consciousness relates to experience rather than in the content of experience, these external changes provide only temporary relief before the underlying patterns reassert themselves. The first noble truth also reveals the Buddha's radical departure from other spiritual and philosophical traditions of his time. Most religious systems of his era focused on achieving union with cosmic forces, appeasing deities, or purifying the soul for a better afterlife. The Buddha focused instead on understanding the precise mechanisms through which consciousness creates its own suffering. This made his approach fundamentally therapeutic rather than mystical, practical rather than metaphysical. His analysis showed that suffering is not punishment for sin, not the result of cosmic injustice, not even primarily caused by external circumstances. Suffering is a byproduct of specific mental processes that can be observed, understood, and ultimately transformed. This insight removes suffering from the realm of theology and places it squarely in the domain of psychology and cognitive science. It suggests that liberation is not about changing the world or appeasing unseen forces, but about understanding and working skillfully with the mind itself. The Buddha also recognized that different people experience these three levels of suffering with different intensities depending on their psychological development and life circumstances. Someone dealing with severe illness or poverty will be primarily concerned with the first level of obvious suffering. Someone with comfortable external circumstances but high sensitivity might be more aware of the second level, the subtle anxiety that accompanies all impermanent pleasures. Someone with considerable psychological development might become conscious of the third level, the underlying restlessness that persists even in states of relative contentment. This recognition led to the development of graduated teachings appropriate for different levels of understanding and different temperaments. The Buddhist path offers practical methods for working with obvious suffering through ethical conduct and basic meditation techniques. It provides more advanced practices for those ready to investigate the subtle suffering that comes from attachment to changing conditions. And it offers the most refined methods for those prepared to examine the deepest level of suffering that comes from the very structure of ordinary consciousness. The First Noble Truth concludes with perhaps the most important recognition of all. The acknowledgement of suffering is not meant to create despair or resignation. It is meant to create what the Buddha called spiritual urgency, a motivation so profound that it can sustain the effort required for complete psychological transformation. When you clearly see how much energy is wasted in the constant attempt to avoid unavoidable aspects of existence, you naturally begin looking for more skillful approaches. When you recognize how much suffering comes from futile resistance to the nature of reality, you become genuinely interested in learning how to work with reality as it actually is. Part 2. The Anatomy of Craving. The second Noble Truth represents perhaps the Buddha's most psychologically sophisticated insight, one that would not be matched in Western psychology for over 2 millennia. Having identified the universal presence of suffering in conscious experience, he turned his analytical attention to its causes. What he discovered was not a list of external factors that create problems, but a precise internal mechanism that operates constantly beneath the threshold of ordinary awareness. This mechanism is called tanha in the original language, usually translated as craving, but encompassing a much more subtle and pervasive process than the English word suggests. Craving is not simply wanting things. It is the quality of desperation that can infuse any form of desire, the sense that your psychological well-being depends on obtaining, maintaining, or avoiding particular experiences. The Buddha identified 3 distinct types of craving that operate simultaneously in ordinary consciousness, each creating its own form of suffering, each reinforcing the others in complex feedback loops. Understanding these 3 types provides a complete map of how consciousness traps itself in dissatisfaction. The first type, kamatanha, is craving for sensual pleasure. This includes not just sexual desire, but the entire range of ways consciousness seeks satisfaction through the 5 senses. The anticipation of a delicious meal when hungry, the desire for physical comfort when uncomfortable, the craving for beautiful sights and sounds and textures. This type of craving seems natural and even necessary for survival, which is why it operates so powerfully and why most people never question its fundamental nature. But the Buddha's analysis revealed something remarkable about sensual craving that most people never notice. The satisfaction it provides is always temporary and always requires increasing stimulation to maintain the same level of pleasure. This is not a moral judgment, but a description of how consciousness actually functions when it becomes dependent on external stimuli for its sense of well-being. The first taste of chocolate is intensely satisfying, the second slightly less so, the third even less, until continued eating becomes mechanical or even unpleasant. More importantly, sensual craving creates a fundamental dependency relationship between consciousness and external conditions. When you need particular experiences to feel complete, you become psychologically vulnerable to the availability of those experiences. This vulnerability manifests as anxiety when desired experiences are unavailable, as clinging when they are present, and as constant seeking when they are absent. The mind becomes like a drug addict, requiring regular fixes of pleasant experiences to maintain psychological equilibrium. The second type, bhavatanha, is craving for existence or becoming. This operates at a much deeper level than sensual desire and is therefore more difficult to recognize.
Restart?
It manifests as the persistent drive to establish, maintain, and expand a sense of personal identity. The desire to become someone important, to achieve lasting accomplishment, to leave a permanent mark on the world. But it also includes subtler forms, like the need to be right in arguments, the compulsion to defend your opinions, the drive to maintain consistency in your self-image. This type of craving reveals consciousness's desperate attempt to create something permanent out of experiences that are fundamentally impermanent.
Right.
Every thought you think disappears almost immediately, yet something in the mind...
Is it still 95? Yeah, it is. Okay, we're gonna be right.
mind keeps trying to build a solid identity out of these vanishing mental events. Every role you play changes depending on circumstances, yet consciousness keeps seeking a stable sense of who you are. Every achievement eventually becomes old news, yet the drive to become something continues unabated. The Buddha observed that craving for existence creates a particular form of psychological suffering that is almost invisible to ordinary consciousness. It manifests as chronic dissatisfaction with the present moment because the present never contains the fully realized identity that craving is seeking to establish. You are always becoming, but never quite arriving at some imagined state of complete selfhood. This creates a persistent sense that real life is always just ahead, that satisfaction will come when you finally become who you are meant to be. The third type, vibhava tanha, is craving for non-existence or annihilation. This is perhaps the most subtle and therefore most dangerous form of craving because it often masquerades as wisdom or spiritual insight. It manifests as the desire to escape from the difficulties of conscious existence through various forms of numbing, avoiding, or checking out. The wish that problems would simply disappear, that difficult emotions would stop arising, that challenging circumstances would magically resolve themselves without any effort on your part. This type of craving can manifest in obvious ways like substance abuse, compulsive entertainment consumption, or workaholism as a form of avoidance. But it also shows up in sophisticated forms that can fool even experienced practitioners. The spiritual seeker who wants to transcend human concerns rather than engage with them skillfully. The meditation student who uses mindfulness techniques to suppress difficult emotions rather than understand them. The philosopher who retreats into abstract thinking to avoid the messiness of actual relationships and responsibilities. The Buddha's analysis revealed that all three types of craving share a common underlying structure. They all involve consciousness projecting its sense of well-being onto something other than present moment awareness itself. Whether seeking pleasure, seeking to become something, or seeking to escape, the mind is constantly looking elsewhere for what can only be found in the quality of awareness itself. This creates a perpetual state of psychological displacement, a constant sense of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the Buddha's investigation went even deeper into the mechanics of how craving operates in real time. He identified a precise sequence of mental events that occurs thousands of times per day, usually below the threshold of conscious recognition. This sequence begins when one of the six senses makes contact with an object. The eye sees a color, the ear hears a sound, the mind encounters a thought or memory. This contact immediately triggers a feeling tone, either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This feeling tone happens automatically and is not yet problematic. The problem arises in what happens next. Based on the feeling tone, craving arises automatically in one of its three forms. If the contact is pleasant, craving for sensual pleasure arises, seeking to repeat or intensify the experience. If the contact threatens the ego structure, craving for existence arises, seeking to defend or expand the sense of self. If the contact is unpleasant or overwhelming, craving for non-existence arises, seeking to avoid or escape the experience. This entire sequence happens in milliseconds and usually passes completely unnoticed. Once craving has arisen, it immediately triggers what the Buddha called upadana, usually translated as clinging or grasping. This is where craving moves from a mental impulse to an active attempt to manipulate experience. Clinging manifests as mental commentary about the experience, stories about what it means, plans for how to get more of it or get rid of it, comparisons with past experiences, projections about future consequences. The mind becomes completely absorbed in these secondary mental activities and loses contact with the direct experience that started the whole sequence. The Buddha identified 4 specific types of clinging that arise from the 3 types of craving. Clinging to sensual pleasures, which includes not just physical desires, but the entire range of ways the mind grasps after pleasant experiences. Clinging to views and opinions, which includes both philosophical beliefs and everyday judgments about how things should be. Clinging to rules and practices, which includes rigid adherence to moral codes, spiritual techniques, or behavioral patterns. And clinging to theories of selfhood, which includes all the ways the mind tries to establish and maintain a solid sense of personal identity. These 4 types of clinging work together to create what the Buddha called the wheel of becoming, a self-perpetuating cycle that keeps consciousness trapped in patterns of seeking and dissatisfaction. Each act of clinging creates karma, intentional actions that shape future experiences. These karmic formations then influence how consciousness encounters new experiences, predisposing it to certain types of craving and clinging. This creates a feedback loop where past clinging influences present perception, which triggers new craving, which creates new clinging, which influences future perception, and so on indefinitely. The Buddha's analysis also revealed why attempts to satisfy craving through getting what you want are ultimately futile. Craving is not actually about the objects it seems to seek. It is about consciousness's attempt to establish a sense of security and completeness through controlling experience. But experience by its very nature cannot be controlled because it is constantly changing. This means that craving is structurally designed to fail, like trying to grasp water with your hands or pin down a shadow. The harder you try, the more elusive satisfaction becomes. Even more problematically, every act of craving strengthens the neural pathways and mental habits that generate more craving. Indulging sensual desires increases sensual desire. Fighting to maintain or improve your self-image increases identification with that self-image. Avoiding difficult experiences increases the fear of difficult experiences. Craving literally feeds on itself, growing stronger through both satisfaction and frustration. This is why people can achieve everything they thought they wanted and still feel fundamentally dissatisfied. The second noble truth concludes with a radical reframe of what it means to take responsibility for your own experience. Most therapeutic and spiritual approaches focus on changing external circumstances, processing past traumas, or developing better coping strategies.
69.
The Buddha's approach focuses instead on understanding the precise moment-to-moment mechanics through which consciousness creates its own suffering. This shifts attention from what is happening to how you are relating to what is happening. It reveals that freedom lies not in getting the right experiences, but in discovering a way of engaging with any experience that does not depend on that experience being different than it is. Part 3. The promise of complete liberation. The third noble truth represents the most audacious claim in the history of human psychology. The suffering that seems so inevitable, so woven into the fabric of conscious existence, can actually end completely. Not temporarily, not partially, not through achieving perfect external circumstances, but through a fundamental transformation in the very structure of how consciousness operates. This state of complete liberation is called nirvana, a word that has been so misunderstood in popular culture that its original meaning has been almost completely obscured. Nirvana literally means extinguishing or blowing out, like a candle flame being extinguished by a gentle breath. What gets extinguished is not consciousness itself, but the compulsive mental processes that keep consciousness trapped in cycles of craving and dissatisfaction.
34.
This is not unconsciousness, not emotional numbness, not withdrawal from life. It is consciousness freed from the psychological mechanisms that create suffering, operating with complete clarity and responsiveness, but without the desperate edge of needing things to be different than they are. The Buddha's description of nirvana challenges virtually every assumption that ordinary consciousness makes about what constitutes a fulfilling life. It is described as the unconditioned, meaning it does not depend on any particular circumstances being present or absent. It is called the deathless, not because the body becomes immortal, but because the sense of psychological death that comes from constant becoming and unbecoming has ended. It is referred to as the ultimate security, not because external threats disappear, but because the internal vulnerability that makes threats threatening has been resolved. But the Buddha's analysis of liberation goes far beyond poetic descriptions into precise psychological territory. He identified exactly what changes when consciousness is freed from the mechanisms of craving and exactly what remains unchanged. The six senses continue to operate normally, bringing information about sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mental phenomena. Pleasant and unpleasant feeling tones continue to arise in response to sensory contact. The body continues to have its needs, preferences continue to exist, practical decisions still need to be made. What disappears is the compulsive reactivity that usually follows these natural processes.
EA Sports. It's in the game.
In the liberated consciousness, pleasant experiences are appreciated without grasping. Unpleasant experiences are acknowledged without resistance, and neutral experiences are met with equanimity. Preferences exist, but they remain light and workable rather than becoming sources of psychological suffering. You can want something without needing it for your emotional survival. You can dislike something without being driven to change it.
Right.
You can engage fully with whatever circumstances arise without your well-being depending on those circumstances being different than they are. The Buddha described this transformation through a series of profound metaphors that reveal different aspects of what liberation actually entails. Nirvana is like a fire that has gone out, not because it has been violently extinguished, but because it has consumed all available fuel. The fuel of suffering is craving, and when craving ends naturally through understanding rather than suppression, the fire of suffering simply goes out by itself. There is no violence in this process, no forcing, no struggle against natural mental processes. It is more like watching a fever break than like winning a battle. Nirvana is also described as crossing to the further shore of a great river. The near shore represents ordinary consciousness trapped in cycles of seeking and dissatisfaction. The far shore represents consciousness freed from these cycles. The river itself represents the spiritual path, the systematic process of training that makes this crossing possible. Once you have crossed, you do not need to carry the raft that brought you across, but neither do you forget the skills you developed in the crossing. Liberation includes and transcends the path that led to it. Perhaps most importantly, nirvana is described as the cessation of becoming. This points to the ending of consciousness's compulsive drive to establish and maintain a sense of separate selfhood. In ordinary awareness, tremendous psychological energy is constantly devoted to defending, improving, and projecting the ego structure. Mental conversations run continuously about who you are, how you compare to others, what you need to do to maintain your identity, how to get others to see you the way you want to be seen. In liberated consciousness, this entire self-maintenance project simply stops operating. Energy that was previously bound up in self-concern becomes available for direct engagement with reality as it actually is. The Buddha's analysis revealed that liberation occurs through understanding rather than through achievement. You do not become liberated by acquiring something new, but by seeing through something that was never actually there in the first place. The separate self that seems so solid and important is revealed to be a construction, a process rather than a thing, a verb rather than a noun. When this construction is seen clearly, it does not need to be destroyed or transcended. It simply stops being a problem because it is recognized as having been a misunderstanding all along. This insight into the constructed nature of selfhood represents one of the Buddha's most radical departures from other spiritual traditions. Most mystical paths involve some form of union, merger, or identification with a larger cosmic reality. The Buddhist path involves seeing that the entity that would unite with something larger never existed as a separate thing in the first place. There is no one to be liberated because liberation is precisely the recognition that the one who seemed to need liberating was a case of mistaken identity. But this recognition does not lead to nihilism or meaninglessness. Instead, it reveals the natural compassion and wisdom that were always present but obscured by the self-maintenance project. When consciousness is no longer primarily concerned with defending and improving a separate identity, it becomes naturally responsive to the suffering and well-being of all sentient beings. Ethics becomes spontaneous rather than effortful, wisdom becomes natural rather than acquired. Love becomes unconditional rather than strategic. The Buddha also addressed the question of whether liberation is permanent or temporary. He distinguished between different levels of realization, some temporary and some irreversible. Temporary states of liberation can occur during meditation or in moments of profound insight, giving practitioners a taste of what is possible. But complete liberation involves a fundamental rewiring of consciousness that cannot be undone once it has occurred. This is not because the liberated person becomes perfect or infallible, but because they have seen through the basic misunderstanding that creates suffering so clearly that they cannot unsee it. The irreversible nature of complete liberation is compared to the impossibility of believing that a rope is a snake once you have seen clearly that it is just a rope. You might still have momentary startled reactions if you encounter the rope unexpectedly in dim light, but these reactions no longer carry the weight of genuine belief. Similarly, the liberated consciousness might still have momentary preferences, emotional reactions, or physical discomforts, but these no longer create the secondary suffering that comes from resistance and craving. They are experienced as natural phenomena arising and passing in awareness rather than as problems that require solving. The Buddha's teaching on liberation also addresses what happens to motivation and engagement with life after the driving force of craving has ended. Many people assume that without the energy of desire, life would become flat, boring, or purposeless. But the Buddha's description suggests exactly the opposite. When consciousness is no longer bound up in the project of self-maintenance, it becomes available for much more creative and spontaneous engagement with whatever circumstances arise. Actions arise from wisdom and compassion rather than from compulsion and neediness, making them far more effective and satisfying. The third noble truth concludes with the recognition that liberation is not a reward for good behavior or a gift from external forces, but the natural result of understanding how suffering is created and systematically removing its causes. This makes the entire Buddhist path fundamentally empirical rather than faith-based. Every step can be verified through direct experience. Every insight can be tested through practical application. Every claim can be investigated through careful observation of your own mind. Liberation is not something you hope for in the future, but something you can glimpse and develop in the present moment through understanding what is actually happening in consciousness right now. Part 4. The technology of transformation. The fourth noble truth presents the most sophisticated system of psychological training ever developed, a comprehensive methodology for transforming consciousness that has been tested and refined across 25 centuries of practical application. This is called the Noble Eightfold Path, though the word path can be misleading in English because it suggests a linear progression from point A to point B. In reality, these 8 factors represent different aspects of a single integrated way of living, each supporting and being supported by all the others. Together they constitute what might be called a technology of liberation, a precise set of tools for working skillfully with the mind. The 8 factors are traditionally organized into 3 groups that address different dimensions of human experience. The wisdom group includes right understanding and right intention, which provide the intellectual and motivational foundation for the entire path. The ethical conduct group includes right speech, right action, and right livelihood, which create the behavioral conditions necessary for deep psychological work. The mental cultivation group includes right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, which directly train consciousness itself. But these divisions are artificial conveniences for teaching purposes. In actual practice, all 8 factors develop simultaneously and interdependently. Right understanding, the first factor, involves developing accurate knowledge about the nature of reality, particularly the 4 noble truths and their implications. But this is not merely intellectual understanding, like memorizing facts for a test. Right understanding means seeing directly how suffering is created through your own mental processes, recognizing the impermanent nature of all conditioned phenomena, and understanding the constructed nature of personal identity. This level of understanding can only be developed through sustained investigation of your own experience, combined with careful study of those who have walked this path before. The development of right understanding typically progresses through several stages. It begins with theoretical knowledge, learning the basic framework of Buddhist psychology through study and reflection. This theoretical foundation then needs to be verified through direct observation of your own mental processes. You begin to notice how craving actually operates in real time, how attachment creates vulnerability, how identification with thoughts and emotions creates suffering. Eventually, if practice is sustained, this understanding becomes intuitive and immediate rather than requiring conscious analysis. You simply see reality clearly without needing to think about what you're seeing. Right intention, the second factor, involves cultivating the proper motivation for engaging in this work. The Buddha identified 3 specific intentions that support liberation: renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. Renunciation does not mean rejecting the world, but developing the wisdom to distinguish between what is actually worth pursuing and what only appears to be worth pursuing. It means recognizing that true satisfaction cannot be found through accumulating experiences, achievements, or external validation. This recognition naturally leads to a simplification of desires and a focus on what genuinely contributes to well-being. Goodwill involves cultivating genuine care for the welfare of all beings, including yourself. This is not manufactured kindness or moral obligation, but the natural result of understanding how interconnected everything is. When you see clearly that your well-being and the well-being of others are intimately connected, caring for others becomes a form of enlightened self-interest. Harmlessness flows naturally from goodwill, manifesting as the intention to avoid actions that cause unnecessary suffering to yourself or others. This includes obvious forms of harm like violence and deception, but also subtle forms like gossip, manipulation, and passive aggression. Right speech, the third factor, addresses how you use language both externally and internally. External right speech involves avoiding lying, harsh language, gossip, and idle chatter, while cultivating truthfulness, kindness, meaningful communication, and helpful silence. But the Buddha's analysis goes much deeper into how speech affects consciousness itself. Every word you speak reinforces certain neural pathways and mental habits. Complaining strengthens the tendency to focus on problems. Gossiping increases preoccupation with other people's business. Harsh speech increases anger and defensiveness. Conversely, speaking truthfully strengthens clarity, speaking kindly increases compassion, speaking meaningfully develops wisdom. Internal right speech, the quality of your mental commentary, may be even more important than external speech. The average human mind generates thousands of words per day in the form of internal dialogue, judgment, planning, and commentary. This internal speech shapes your perception of reality moment by moment, creating the lens through which you interpret everything that happens. Learning to observe and gradually refine your internal speech patterns is one of the most practical aspects of the Buddhist path. This does not mean suppressing thoughts, but developing the ability to recognize unhelpful mental commentary and gently redirect attention toward more skillful ways of relating to experience. Right action, the fourth factor, involves aligning your behavior with wisdom and compassion. The Buddha identified specific actions to avoid: killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, intoxication, and lying. But right action goes far beyond following rules to include developing sensitivity to the consequences of all your behaviors. Every action creates karmic results, shaping both your internal mental states and your external circumstances. Right action means choosing behaviors that support greater freedom, wisdom, and compassion, while avoiding behaviors that increase suffering, confusion, and selfishness. The practice of right action requires developing what might be called ethical sensitivity, the ability to sense the subtle effects of your choices on your own consciousness and on the well-being of others. This sensitivity develops gradually through careful attention to the results of different types of behavior. You begin to notice how certain actions leave you feeling more peaceful and clear, while others create agitation and confusion. You observe how your behavior affects the people around you, how kindness and generosity create positive responses, while selfishness and aggression create negative ones. Over time, ethical behavior becomes natural and spontaneous rather than effortful because you directly perceive its benefits. Right livelihood, the fifth factor, extends right action into the realm of how you earn your living and organize your economic life. The Buddha specifically mentioned avoiding livelihoods that involve harming living beings, such as trading in weapons, living beings, meat, intoxicants, and poison. But the principle applies more broadly to any way of earning money that requires you to act against your deeper values or that contributes significantly to the suffering of others. Right livelihood also includes developing a healthy relationship with money and material possessions, neither clinging to wealth nor rejecting it entirely. The practice of right livelihood often requires difficult choices about balancing idealism with practical necessity. Few people in modern society have the luxury of earning money in ways that are completely aligned with Buddhist principles. The goal is not perfection, but continuous movement in the direction of greater integrity and less harm. This might involve changing careers gradually, modifying how you approach your current work, or simply becoming more conscious of the ethical dimensions of your economic choices. Right livelihood is ultimately about recognizing that how you earn and spend money is inseparable from your spiritual development. Right effort, the sixth factor, addresses the quality of energy you bring to spiritual practice and to life in general. This is not about forcing yourself to be disciplined or pushing through resistance with willpower. Right effort involves learning to work with mental energy skillfully, applying just the right amount of intensity for each situation. Too little effort and you remain stuck in old patterns. Too much effort and you create tension and resistance. The Buddha compared right effort to tuning a stringed instrument, finding the precise tension that allows the instrument to produce beautiful music. The Buddha identified 4 specific applications of right effort. First, the effort to prevent unwholesome mental states from arising by maintaining awareness and avoiding situations that trigger harmful patterns. Second, the effort to abandon unwholesome mental states that have already arisen by neither suppressing them nor indulging them, but understanding them clearly until they naturally dissolve. Third, the effort to cultivate wholesome mental states that have not yet arisen by creating conditions that support wisdom, compassion, and peace. Fourth, the effort to maintain and develop wholesome mental states that are already present by appreciating them and providing the conditions they need to flourish. Right mindfulness, the 7th factor, involves developing the capacity to observe the mind without being caught up in its contents. This is perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Buddhist practice, and the one that has had the greatest influence on modern psychology and neuroscience. Mindfulness is not relaxation, though it can be relaxing. It is not positive thinking, though it can improve your mood. Mindfulness is a specific mental skill, the ability to maintain clear awareness of present moment experience without getting lost in stories, judgments, or reactions about that experience. The Buddha identified 4 foundations of mindfulness that provide a complete framework for training attention. Mindfulness of the body includes awareness of breath, posture, physical sensations, and bodily activities. This foundation grounds awareness in immediate physical reality and provides a stable reference point when the mind becomes agitated or confused. Mindfulness of feelings involves recognizing the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling tone that accompanies every moment of experience. This foundation helps you catch the arising of craving before it becomes full-blown clinging. Mindfulness of mind involves observing mental states and emotional patterns without being identified with them. You learn to recognize anger without becoming angry, to notice fear without being afraid, to observe desire without being driven by it. This creates tremendous psychological freedom because you are no longer at the mercy of whatever emotional weather happens to be passing through consciousness. Mindfulness of phenomena involves observing how all experiences arise and pass away according to natural laws rather than according to personal preference. This foundation develops deep acceptance of the way things actually are rather than the way you want them to be. Right concentration, the 8th factor, involves training the mind to rest in states of profound stability and clarity. This is not about spacing out or becoming unconscious, but about developing the capacity to sustain attention on a single object for extended periods without distraction or dullness. The Buddha described a series of increasingly refined concentrative states called jhanas, each characterized by specific qualities of peace, joy, and mental unification. These states are not ends in themselves, but powerful tools for developing insight and understanding. The cultivation of concentration typically begins with focusing attention on a simple object like the breath or a visual image. At first, the mind wanders constantly, and maintaining focus for even a few seconds requires considerable effort. Gradually, with consistent practice, the mind becomes more stable and attention more refined. As concentration deepens, you begin to experience states of profound peace and clarity that reveal the natural potential of consciousness when it is not scattered and agitated. These concentrated states provide both a refuge from the chaos of ordinary mental activity and a platform for investigating the nature of reality with unprecedented clarity. The Noble Eightfold Path represents a complete education in human consciousness, addressing every aspect of mental, emotional, and behavioral functioning. Unlike many spiritual systems that focus primarily on beliefs or practices, Buddhism provides practical methods for transforming the entire structure of how you relate to experience. The path is simultaneously profound enough to occupy a lifetime of investigation and practical enough to provide immediate benefits for anyone willing to experiment with its methods. Most importantly, every aspect of the path can be verified through direct experience, making Buddhism fundamentally empirical rather than faith-based. Part 5. The Mirage of Personal Identity.
Mirage.
Perhaps no aspect of Buddhist psychology is more revolutionary or more difficult to grasp than its analysis of personal identity. What you take to be yourself, the sense of being a continuous, separate entity moving through time, is revealed to be a construction, a process rather than a thing, a verb rather than a noun. This insight, called anatta or not self, represents one of the Buddha's most original contributions to human understanding, and one of the most practically transformative recognitions available to consciousness. It does not mean you do not exist, but that you exist very differently than you imagine you do. The Buddha's investigation into the nature of selfhood began with a simple but profound question. If there is a self, where exactly is it? This is not a philosophical question, but an empirical investigation that anyone can conduct. When you look for this self that seems so obvious and important, what do you actually find? Is it in your body? Your body is constantly changing, replacing nearly all its cells every 7 years, yet you maintain a sense of being the same person. Is the self in your thoughts? Thoughts arise and disappear constantly, and the content of your thinking changes dramatically depending on circumstances, yet something seems to remain constant. Perhaps the self is in your emotions or personality traits, but these too are constantly shifting depending on your mood, health, social situation, and life experiences. The person you are when tired is different from the person you are when well rested. The person you are with your family is different from the person you are with strangers. The person you were 10 years ago had different opinions, preferences, and concerns than the person you are today. Yet through all these changes, something maintains the sense of being a continuous identity. What is this something, and where exactly can it be found? The Buddha's analysis revealed that what we call the self is actually a dynamic process involving 5 constantly changing components called the 5 aggregates. These aggregates are form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Form includes the physical body and all material aspects of existence. Sensation refers to the immediate feeling tone that arises when consciousness makes contact with any object through the 6 senses. Perception involves the recognition and interpretation of sensory and mental data. Mental formations include all the complex mental processes like thoughts, emotions, intentions, and psychological patterns. Consciousness refers to the basic knowing quality that makes experience possible. These 5 aggregates are constantly arising, changing, and dissolving in response to conditions. In every moment, millions of microprocesses are occurring as the aggregates interact with each other and with environmental conditions. What creates the illusion of a separate, continuous self is the mind's tendency to create a story of coherence and permanence out of this constant flux. It is like watching a movie and forgetting that what appears to be smooth motion is actually thousands of still frames projected in rapid sequence. The sense of being a solid, continuous self is a perceptual construction, not a fundamental reality. But the Buddha's analysis goes even deeper into the mechanics of how this construction occurs. He identified a specific psychological process that operates continuously to maintain the illusion of selfhood. This process involves consciousness constantly identifying with whatever is arising in awareness and claiming it as me or mine. When a thought arises, there is an immediate sense that this is my thought. When an emotion appears, it becomes my emotion. When a sensation occurs, it is experienced as happening to me. This constant process of identification and appropriation creates the sense of being a central owner of experience. The problem with this identification process is that it creates a fundamental contradiction at the heart of consciousness. You identify with things that are constantly changing as if they were permanent. You claim ownership of processes that are actually impersonal. You treat conditioned phenomena as if they constituted an unconditioned self. This creates a persistent sense of insecurity because you are trying to build a stable identity out of inherently unstable materials. It is like trying to construct a solid building on quicksand or create a permanent sculpture out of flowing water. The harder you try to solidify the sense of self, the more unstable and anxiety-provoking it becomes. The Buddha used a powerful analogy to illustrate this predicament. Imagine trying to grasp water with your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the more water escapes between your fingers. The same is true with the attempt to establish a solid sense of personal identity. The more desperately consciousness grasps after selfhood, the more elusive and problematic that selfhood becomes. This is why people can have everything they thought they needed to be happy and still feel fundamentally insecure. The problem is not with what they have or lack, but with the entire project of trying to create security through identification with changing conditions. The recognition of not-self does not happen through philosophical reasoning alone, though intellectual understanding can prepare the ground. It typically occurs through sustained meditative investigation that reveals the constructed nature of personal identity through direct observation. As mindfulness develops, you begin to notice the constant process of identification that usually operates below the threshold of awareness. You catch the mind in the act of claiming ownership of experiences, of creating stories about who you are based on temporary mental states, of defending and maintaining a sense of separate selfhood. Initially, this recognition can be quite disturbing because it challenges the most fundamental assumption of ordinary consciousness. If there is no solid self, then who is having these experiences? Who is making decisions? Who is responsible for actions? Who is practicing the spiritual path? These questions point to the need for a complete reframe of what it means to be conscious. Experience continues to occur, but it is no longer centered around a separate experiencer. Decisions continue to be made, but they arise from the totality of conditions rather than from a central decision maker. Responsibility reality continues to exist, but it is distributed throughout the web of interdependent causation rather than concentrated in an individual entity. The Buddha addressed these concerns by distinguishing between conventional truth and ultimate truth. Conventionally, it is perfectly appropriate to use language like I and you, mine and yours, self and other. These distinctions are useful for practical purposes like communication, social organization, and moral responsibility. But ultimately, these conventional designations do not point to solid, separate entities. They are practical conveniences, like the lines of longitude and latitude that help us navigate the globe, but do not actually exist as physical markings on the Earth. Understanding this distinction allows you to function effectively in the conventional world, while maintaining awareness of the deeper truth of interconnectedness and impermanence. The practical implications of understanding not self are profound and liberating. Most psychological suffering comes from defending, maintaining, and enhancing a sense of separate selfhood. When this selfhood is recognized as a construction rather than a reality, tremendous psychological energy becomes available for more creative and compassionate engagement with life. You can have preferences without being imprisoned by them, opinions without needing others to agree with them, experiences without being defined by them. The defensive reactivity that characterizes so much human interaction begins to relax because there is less sense of a separate self that needs defending. The recognition of not-self also transforms the entire motivation for spiritual practice. Instead of seeking to improve or transcend yourself, you begin to see through the self that seemed to need improving or transcending. Instead of trying to achieve some future state of enlightenment, you recognize that the one who would achieve enlightenment is part of the problem that needs to be understood. Practice becomes less about becoming someone better and more about seeing through the illusion of being someone at all. This shift in motivation makes the path both more humble and more profound. The Buddha's teaching on not-self also reveals why compassion arises naturally as wisdom develops. When the barriers between self and other are seen to be conceptual constructions rather than fundamental realities, caring for others becomes as natural as caring for yourself. The suffering of other beings is no longer experienced as happening to someone else, but as arising within the same field of interdependent awareness that includes what you conventionally call your own experience. This recognition transforms ethics from a set of imposed rules to a spontaneous expression of understanding. Understanding not self also provides a completely different perspective on death and impermanence. If there is no solid, continuous self to begin with, then there is nothing solid or continuous that can be lost through death. What dies is a particular configuration of the 5 aggregates. But the aggregates themselves continue in new forms according to the law of cause and effect. This does not necessarily imply personal survival after death, but it does suggest that the sharp distinction between existence and non-existence that terrifies ordinary consciousness is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Death becomes not the annihilation of a self, but the dissolution of a temporary pattern in the ongoing flow of natural processes. Part 6. The River of Constant Change. Everything that exists is in constant flux, arising and passing away with every moment, never remaining the same from one instant to the next. This insight into universal impermanence, called anicca in the original language, represents one of the Buddha's most fundamental observations about the nature of reality. Yet despite its obviousness when pointed out, impermanence remains one of the most difficult truths for consciousness to fully accept and integrate. The mind's resistance to acknowledging constant change creates much of the suffering that characterizes ordinary human experience. The Buddha's investigation into impermanence began with careful observation of his own direct experience. Every breath has a beginning, middle, and end. Every thought arises from nothing, exists for a brief moment and dissolves back into nothing. Every emotion has an identifiable arising, a period of intensity, and a natural dissolution. Every physical sensation appears, changes quality and intensity, and eventually disappears. Even the most persistent mental states, like depression or chronic anxiety, are actually composed of countless micro-moments of arising and passing away when observed with sufficient precision. This universal characteristic of arising and passing away applies not just to obvious things like thoughts and emotions, but to everything that can be experienced. Your sense of personal identity changes constantly as new experiences modify your self-concept and old memories fade or transform. Your relationships evolve continuously as both you and others change in response to circumstances and inner development. Your beliefs and opinions shift over time as new information and experiences challenge old assumptions. Even your physical body is in constant flux, with cells dying and being born, chemical processes creating and breaking down molecules, energy flowing in and out continuously. But the Buddha's analysis of impermanence goes much deeper than simply observing that things change over time. He recognized that what appears to be continuous existence is actually composed of countless discrete moments of arising and dissolution happening with extraordinary rapidity. What you experience as a solid table is actually billions of atoms vibrating in space, constantly exchanging energy with their environment. What you experience as a continuous stream of consciousness is actually millions of micro-moments of knowing arising and passing away in rapid succession. Reality at the deepest level is more like a strobe light than a steady flame, more like a movie than a still photograph. This insight into the moment-to-moment nature of existence has profound implications for understanding how suffering is created and how it can be resolved. Most psychological pain comes from consciousness trying to make permanent what is inherently impermanent. You want pleasurable experiences to last forever. You want painful experiences to end immediately. You want your sense of identity to remain stable and secure. But the very nature of existence makes these desires impossible to fulfill. Trying to stop change is like trying to stop a river from flowing or prevent the sun from setting. The effort itself creates tension and frustration while accomplishing nothing. The Buddha identified 3 specific ways that resistance to impermanence creates suffering. The first is obvious. Clinging to pleasant experiences that are naturally ending creates the pain of loss and separation. The joy of falling in love is shadowed by the fear of losing that love. The pleasure of success is diminished by anxiety about maintaining that success. The satisfaction of achievement is complicated by worry about future failures. This type of suffering is widely recognized, though not usually understood as a problem with impermanence rather than with particular circumstances. The second way is more subtle. Resisting unpleasant experiences that are naturally arising creates additional layers of suffering beyond the original discomfort. Physical pain becomes emotional anguish when accompanied by thoughts like "this should not be happening," or "when will this end?" Difficult emotions like sadness or fear become psychological problems when consciousness fights against them rather than allowing them to follow their natural course of arising and dissolving. The resistance creates tension, the tension creates more resistance, and what might have been a brief passing cloud becomes a persistent storm. The third way is the most subtle and therefore the most pervasive, the constant background anxiety that comes from existing as a conscious being in a world where nothing remains stable. Even when things are going well, there is an underlying sense of insecurity because consciousness knows intuitively that current conditions will not last. This creates a persistent feeling of walking on thin ice, never being able to fully relax because change could occur at any moment. This type of suffering is so fundamental to ordinary consciousness that most people mistake it for a basic fact of existence rather than recognizing it as the result of resistance to the natural flow of change. The Buddha's approach to working with impermanence is neither resignation nor denial, but what might be called radical acceptance. This means learning to align consciousness with the natural flow of change rather than fighting against it. Radical acceptance does not mean becoming passive or fatalistic, but developing the wisdom to distinguish between what can be skillfully influenced and what must be allowed to follow its natural course. You can make efforts to create conditions that support your well-being, but you cannot control the outcomes of those efforts because outcomes depend on countless factors beyond your influence. The practice of accepting impermanence typically develops through stages. Initially, there is intellectual acknowledgement that things change, but little emotional integration of this understanding. You know that pleasant experiences will end, but you still suffer when they do. You understand that difficult times will pass, but you still resist them when they arise. This stage is important because it provides the conceptual framework for deeper investigation, but it does not yet transform the basic patterns of clinging and resistance. The next stage involves beginning to observe the process of change directly through meditative awareness. You start to notice the constant arising and passing of thoughts, emotions, and sensations in real time. This direct observation gradually weakens the illusion that experiences are solid and permanent, making it easier to let go when change occurs. You begin to develop what might be called change readiness, a quality of mental flexibility that allows you to adjust more quickly to new circumstances rather than remaining stuck in how things used to be. The deepest stage of integration involves discovering that impermanence is not a problem to be solved, but the very nature of life itself. Change becomes a source of freedom rather than anxiety, because it means that no difficult situation is permanent and no pleasant situation needs to be clung to desperately. You begin to appreciate the freshness and creativity that constant change makes possible, recognizing that a world without impermanence would be static, boring, and ultimately lifeless. The very qualities that make existence meaningful, such as growth, learning, and development, depend entirely on the fact that nothing remains the same. This transformed relationship with impermanence has immediate practical benefits. Decision-making becomes less anxious because you understand that no decision is permanent, and mistakes can be corrected as new information becomes available. Relationships become less possessive because you appreciate people as they are in each moment rather than trying to freeze them into fixed roles or expectations. Planning for the future becomes more flexible because you hold your goals lightly, willing to adjust them as circumstances change. Even aging and physical decline become easier to accept because they are recognized as natural expressions of the universal process of change rather than personal failures or cosmic injustices. The Buddha also used the understanding of impermanence as a tool for working with difficult mental states. When experiencing strong emotions like anger, fear, or sadness, remembering that these states are impermanent can provide immediate relief from their intensity. Instead of getting caught up in the story about why you are feeling this way or what needs to be done about it, you can simply observe the emotion arising, changing, and eventually dissolving on its own. This does not mean suppressing emotions or pretending they do not matter, but recognizing their temporary nature and allowing them space to follow their natural course. The insight into impermanence also transforms the entire approach to spiritual practice. Instead of seeking permanent states of peace or enlightenment, you begin to appreciate the dynamic quality of awakened consciousness. Wisdom is not a fixed achievement, but a flowing response to changing conditions. Compassion is not a permanent emotional state, but a continuous adjustment to the suffering around you. Liberation is not a final destination, but an ongoing process of letting go. This understanding makes the path both more humble and more sustainable because it removes the pressure to achieve some imagined state of perfection. Understanding impermanence deeply also reveals the interconnected nature of all phenomena. Nothing changes in isolation because everything exists in relationship with everything else. When you change, your relationships change. When your relationships change, the people around you change. When they change, their relationships change, and the effects ripple outward indefinitely. This recognition makes you more conscious of how your thoughts, words, and actions contribute to the constantly changing web of existence, increasing your sense of responsibility while simultaneously reducing the weight of that responsibility by distributing it throughout the entire network of interdependence. Part 7. The Web Without a Weaver. Nothing exists independently. This statement represents perhaps the most profound and far-reaching insight in Buddhist philosophy, one that challenges the deepest assumptions of ordinary consciousness about the nature of reality. Called pratitya samutpada, or dependent origination, this principle reveals that everything arises in dependence upon conditions, exists only in relationship, and dissolves when those conditions change. Understanding this interconnectedness transforms not just how you see the world, but how you see yourself and your place in the vast web of existence. The Buddha's investigation into interdependence began with a simple but revolutionary question. How do things come into existence? Most people assume that objects and experiences exist independently and then interact with other independent objects and experiences. The Buddha's careful observation revealed exactly the opposite. Things do not exist first and then relate, but rather come into existence through relationship itself. Nothing has inherent independent existence because everything depends on causes and conditions for its arising, maintenance, and dissolution. Consider something as simple as the experience of seeing a tree. This experience requires the presence of a tree, functioning eyes, adequate lighting, a nervous system capable of processing visual information, previous experiences that allow you to recognize the patterns of light and shadow as a tree, and countless other conditions. Remove any of these conditions, and the experience of seeing a tree cannot occur. The experience does not exist independently and then encounter these conditions, but comes into existence precisely through the coming together of these conditions. When the conditions change or disappear, the experience changes or disappears as well. This same principle applies to everything that can be experienced, including mental states, emotions, and even the sense of personal identity. Anger does not exist as a thing somewhere in your mind waiting to be triggered. It arises when specific conditions come together. A triggering event, a story about what that event means, physical tension in the body, memories of similar situations, and various other psychological and environmental factors. Change any of these conditions, and the anger changes or disappears entirely. The anger has no existence apart from these interdependent conditions. The Buddha formulated this insight into what is called the principle of dependent origination. This arising that arises, this ceasing that ceases. This principle operates at every level of existence, from the most obvious physical processes to the most subtle psychological phenomena. Seeds sprout when they encounter the right conditions of soil, moisture, temperature, and light. Thoughts arise when consciousness encounters objects through the 6 senses in the presence of attention and memory. Suffering appears when craving meets impermanence in the context of identification with changing conditions. Liberation occurs when wisdom encounters craving in the presence of sustained mindful investigation. The traditional teaching presents dependent origination through a 12-link chain that describes how suffering perpetuates itself through cycles of conditioned existence. This chain begins with fundamental ignorance about the nature of reality, particularly ignorance about impermanence, suffering, and the constructed nature of selfhood. This ignorance creates karmic formations, intentional actions based on misunderstanding that shape future experiences. These formations condition consciousness, which conditions name and form, which conditions the 6 sense spheres, which conditions contact, which conditions feeling, which conditions craving, which conditions clinging, which conditions becoming, which conditions birth, which conditions aging and death. While this traditional formulation can seem abstract, it describes psychological processes that occur thousands of times per day. Every moment of unconscious reactivity strengthens mental patterns that shape how you perceive and respond to future situations. Every act of craving reinforces the neural pathways that generate more craving. Every moment of resistance increases the tendency toward resistance. Every instance of identification with thoughts and emotions makes that identification more automatic and compelling. Suffering perpetuates itself through these feedback loops of conditioned response. But the same principle that explains how suffering perpetuates also reveals how it can be interrupted and ultimately ended. When ignorance is replaced by understanding, the entire chain of conditioning begins to transform. When you see clearly how mental states arise in dependence upon conditions, you can begin working skillfully with those conditions rather than being at their mercy. When you understand how craving creates clinging, you can catch the process earlier in its development before it becomes overwhelming. When you recognize how identification creates suffering, you can learn to hold experiences more lightly. The insight into interdependence also reveals why individual liberation is inseparable from universal liberation. Since nothing exists independently, your well-being and the well-being of all other beings are intimately interconnected. Your mental states affect everyone you encounter. Their responses affect their other relationships, and the effects ripple outward throughout the entire web of existence. Conversely, the suffering and joy of others affects you directly through the same networks of interdependence. This recognition makes compassion not just a moral choice, but an acknowledgement of factual reality. Understanding interdependence transforms the entire notion of personal responsibility. You are neither completely responsible for everything that happens to you, nor completely powerless in the face of external circumstances. Your actions and mental states influence the conditions you encounter, but those conditions also shape your capacity to respond